While Larry watched the streetlights from Brooklyn, Joe Gallo sat behind the walls of Attica and remade himself into something the newspapers could not easily file. He read with the hunger of a man who had finally been permitted to be alone with his own mind. The nights ran long under weak bulbs, and the books he chose sharpened him. Kant and Spinoza for the structure of thought, Nietzsche for the terrible remontrance of will, Voltaire and Wilde for the wit that could cut without drawing blood. He filled the margins with thoughts on philosophy and kept a notebook where ideas about life sat beside notes on street strategy. Part reflection, part practical guide for the world that he lived in. For his own safety, he chose solitary confinement over the yard. Larry warned him never to accept outside food, because men who could not reach him with a pistol might yet reach him with a poisoned sandwich, and Profaci had men everywhere. But isolation does not last forever, and Attica reabsorbed him into the general population, where decisions had to be made carefully, and survival depended on reading the room. However, was a minefield of its own. The Irish stuck with the Irish. The Puerto Ricans stuck with their own, and many Italian inmates looked at the name Gallo and saw only a blood debt against Joe Profaci. Joey read the geography of the yard and went a very different way. He got close with black inmates, partly for safety, but mostly because he'd always been the kind of man who talked to whoever he wanted to, no matter what the rules were. At the barber shop, the black and white chairs stood side by side, but white prisoners refused black barbers, leaving men idle while others waited. Joe sat without fuss. He let a black barber cut his hair, and in a place where small gestures are magnified into banners, that was noticed. The Ku Klux Klansmen inside Attica noticed it too. The first attack came out of a blind spot between routine and spite. A Klansman who was locked for using a crowbar on another inmate suddenly had a door that did not latch. And the story that Joe told was simple and ugly. A guard with Nazi sympathies had left it open. The Klansman came at him in the corridor, and Joe fought the way that men fight when there is nothing left to negotiate. He bit off the Klansman's ear and flushed it down the toilet to deny any trophy to the men who would have made one of him. For that, he was sent to Reception B, the prison's version of limbo. And he learned the choreography of humiliation there, a bucket that was used for waste, and also one that he had to wash his pots in, a cell that turned the man inward until he was ready to be considered again. If paranoia is a sane response to certain structures, Joe's paranoia enlarged under that discipline. He believed with cause, and without that, everyone was out to engineer his death. The Profaci faction, the guards, the KKK inmates, and the prison officials who preferred quiet explanations. He understood that the most practical escape was not a hole in the wall, but a transfer order. So he sued. He wrote what the law required and what the headlines wanted, that his rights were being violated, that he was being targeted for associating with black inmates, that he had the right to talk to whomever he wished. After 5 months in Attica with his name in more files than most, a prison psychiatrist helped secure his transfer to Green Haven Correctional Facility, 2 hours from Brooklyn, and a significant upgrade on the battlefield that was Attica. In those years, Green Haven's yard was a small version of the outside world. The Black Panthers, the Muslims, the young lords, all had their corners. Most white inmates kept their distance. Joe didn't. He drifted between groups, listened to their arguments, asked questions, and shared what he had. The care packages he requested from home, Camel cigarettes, cigars, Swiss cheese, pickles, tins of fish, weren't luxuries so much as a way to hold on to a sense of control. He passed food around when it made sense. Generosity bought safety, but it also bought him the time to talk, to build friendships, to imagine alliances that reached beyond prison walls. Joe told men from every group that when they got out, they didn't need to return to the old rules, the racism, the boundaries, the ideas that each neighborhood had to stay in its own lane. He'd say that there was money to be made by working together, by tearing up the script that the Mafia and the city had been using for 50 years. And the man he bonded with the most was Nicky Barnes. the rising heroin kingpin from Harlem. Sharp, disciplined, and ambitious. The two of them talked about power, about networks, about what the streets might look like if black and Italian crews ever decided to cooperate instead of compete. But for now, those streets of Brooklyn and the uneasy peace that rested on it were about to be shattered. On the evening of June the 7th, 1962, the man who had ruled one of New York's oldest Mafia families for more than 3 decades finally lost his empire to something more relentless than ambition: cancer. Joseph Profaci, the olive oil king, died quietly at his Long Island estate. The liver disease that had been eating at him for years did what the Gallo brothers never could. The newspapers that once printed his name in whispers now ran it in bold. His reign had stretched from the last days of Prohibition through the entire post-war boom, a period in which he transformed a Brooklyn street gang into one of the 5 organized crime families of New York City. For the Gallos, the timing was poetic. They hadn't managed to kill him, but nature had done the work for them. After his death, control of the family typically passed to Profaci's brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco, the loyal underboss who had survived the Gallo kidnappings the year before. Magliocco was cautious, understated, and ill-equipped to lead a family fractured by paranoia. His first task was to hold the peace that the commission demanded. But beneath the silence, the vendettas kept breathing. The Gallo-Profaci war didn't end with Profaci's funeral. It only lost its figurehead. Within weeks, blood returned to the Brooklyn pavement. The Gallo, convinced that Carmine, the snake Persico, as they were now calling him, had betrayed them during the 1961 strangling attempt, prepared a carbon, the old underworld solution for problems that could not be solved face to face. Persico was the target, and by all rights should have died on March the 17th, 1963. But he left the car only moments before it exploded. A twist of chance that reinforced his reputation for being immortal, which was a nickname along with the snake that he would have for life. But the Gallos didn't let up. In May 1963, the war hit one of its most critical points, when Carmine Persico and Alphonse D'Ambrosio, known as Funzy D, the brother of Sally D, were ambushed on Bond Street while getting into a car outside a Brooklyn bar. Another car pulled up alongside them and opened fire without a word. Bullets tore through the windows. Funz D was hit in the hand and shoulder. Persico survived the wounds to his hand, shoulder, and neck, but any of the shots could have killed him. Both men dove to the pavement and managed to crawl to safety as the shooters sped off. The attack made headlines immediately. Newspapers ran front-page stories about mob gunmen firing in broad daylight, and detectives publicly acknowledged that the Gallo-Profaci conflict was no longer a contained feud. It had become a full-scale war spilling onto Brooklyn's streets. The shooting underscored 2 things. The Gallo were still willing to take direct shots at the Profaci leadership, and the Profaci leadership would return fire. The bloodletting became relentless. On the 13th of June, Vincent Ducci, a Profaci soldier, was shot 5 times with a pistol and died instantly. Police detained Gallo crew member Gennaro Jerry Bassiano, but released him for lack of evidence. 6 days later, on June the 19th, Alfred Mandela, a 41-year-old retired longshoreman of whom no photograph survived, was sitting outside his home in a beach chair when a man walked up, leveled a gun, and fired. Mandela had supplied weapons to the Gallos, and now he was the latest casualty of the war, and the summer heat brought no relief. On July the 24th, Joe Gallo's old bodyguard, Ali Baba, was gunned down on the Hoboken docks in New Jersey. 3 bullets to the stomach as he stepped off a cruise ship. The suspects were Joseph Joe Iacovelli and Carmine DeBari, known as Sonny Pinto, and both of them were aligned to the Profaci crew. Then came August the 9th, 1963. Joseph Biscardiello, a veteran soldier who had shifted allegiances too many times, was driving through Brooklyn when his car was riddled with bullets. He died instantly. That same day, Profaci loyalists struck back on Route 347 in Port Jefferson. Louis Cadillac Louis Maranzano was driving down on what is now the Nesconset Highway in front of the Nesconset Shopping Center in Long Island when Anthony Fatt, Tony Regina, and John Moose Batista, two Profaci crew members, opened fire on his car. The shooting left Cadillac Louis dead at the age of 26. Regina and Batista were later arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Brooklyn newspapers began to call it the Year of the Guns. By now, the FBI and NYPD had counted over 30 killings linked to the Profaci-Gallo feud. Every few weeks, a new name appeared in the papers, each accompanied by the same pattern. A car, a flash, a scream, a quote from the police about underworld tensions. No one outside the families knew precisely who was winning, and inside the families, everyone had lost something. As 1963 waned, the war's momentum slowed, not because anyone had triumphed, but because both sides were absolutely exhausted. Too many shooters were dead, too many soldiers in hiding or behind bars. By the end of 1963, Joseph Mario's control of the old Profaci family was collapsing. His health was failing, his grip on the crew was weak, and he was increasingly isolated. In that vulnerability, he made the worst decision of his career. Magliocco secretly aligned himself with Joseph Bonanno, who was facing his own decline and growing resentment toward the commission. Together, they devised an extraordinary plan to assassinate several commission members, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Stefano Magaddino, and Frank D. Simone, and reshape the Mafia's hierarchy in their favor. Magliocco was assigned the job of killing Gambino and Lucchese, and he passed the contract to one of his top men, Joseph Colombo. But Colombo had absolutely no intention of carrying out the hit, which would have been suicide. Instead, he quietly went to Gambino and Lucchese and exposed the entire plot. He understood immediately that Magliocco would take the blame, but Bonanno, the true architect, would be the real target. The commission moved fast. Bonanno ignored the summons and fled to Montreal, leaving Magliocco alone to answer for the conspiracy. Shaken and in poor health, Magliocco confessed. Commission spared his life, but he was forced to step down as boss and pay a $50,000 fine. He retired quietly, and within months, December 28, 1963 to be exact, he died of a heart attack on Long Island. Colombo, meanwhile, was rewarded for his loyalty. Gambino elevated the 41-year-old to boss of the former Profaci family, becoming the first American-born boss of a New York crime family. A move that shocked New York and effectively ended the old order of mustache pates. What had begun as a desperate power grab instead created the Colombo crime family and set the stage for the next chapter of the Gallo War. For Colombo, it was a remarkable rise from mid-level capo to mafia boss in a single conversation. But it also signaled a generational shift. The cautious, calculating Gambino wanted stability, and Colombo, at least on the surface, offered that. For the Gallo brothers, it meant that their oldest enemy had been replaced by a younger, more pragmatic one. But for now, the war fizzled out, because by the mid-1960s, Brooklyn had changed. The docks were no longer the empire that they had been under the Anastasia, and the neighborhoods that once supplied soldiers to both sides were now feeding the city's new youth movements. The Gallo crew, or what was left of it, had aged, scattered, or adapted. Larry, increasingly introspective and quietly ill, kept his routine simple. Albert Kid Blast handled what little business remained, and Joe, still behind bars, watched it all unfold through headlines and letters. 2 years later, tragedy came quietly. On May the 17th, 1968, Larry Gallo died at Nassau Hospital after a long fight with cancer. He was 41 years of age. For all his volatility, Larry had been the axis of the brothers' loyalty, the calmest in the storm, the first to take a fall, and the last to truly believe in peace. When the news reached Green Haven, Joe Gallo arranged for a temporary leave from prison to see his brother one final time. The reunion in the funeral home was brief, wordless, and devastating. Whatever illusions Joe still had about immortality died with Larry. That day, back in prison, Joe's transformation deepened. By the end of the 1960s, he was a man halfway between criminal legend and philosopher, quoted in magazines and studied by criminologists who didn't quite know what to make of him. His paintings, dark, surreal, and full of caged animals, were occasionally displayed in small galleries. Journalists called him the thinking gangster, the underworld intellectual, and the poet of President Street. The Commission, meanwhile, was reorganizing itself under Gambino's quiet empire. Joe Colombo began to consolidate power. He was everything that Profaci had not been. He was approachable, modern, and a man who understood the value of public image. He would soon found the Italian-American Civil Rights League, turning himself into a celebrity and, ironically, paving the way for the re-emergence of the one man the underworld thought it had buried, Crazy Joe Gallo. The war that had started with kidnappings and garrots was giving way to something stranger, a battle over perception. The old bosses ruled from the shadows, and the new ones smiled for the cameras. And the man who had once terrified Brooklyn now read philosophy under prison lights, waiting for the world outside to forget just long enough for him to rewrite the script. When Crazy Joe walked out of Greenhaven Correctional Facility in April 1971, he wasn't the swaggering young killer who'd gone in. He was a man 9 years older, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous in silence than in noise. The old world he'd left behind, the one ruled by the rackets, the waterfront, and the whisper of garrotes, had long become something else entirely. America in 1971 was talking about revolution, civil rights, and power in the streets. Joe had spent his sentence studying those very words. During his sentence, New York's prisons were primed for racial violence. Overcrowding, poor conditions, and openly biased treatment from mostly white guards created constant friction between black, Puerto Rican, and white inmates. Small disputes could explode into full-scale riots with almost no warning. During one of these outbreaks at Greenhaven, a guard was stabbed and left on the floor as inmates closed in. Joe stepped in, pulled the wounded officer behind him, and held the crowd back until help arrived. The guard later testified that Joe could have killed him, but chose not to. A single act of restraint that played a major role in securing Joe's early parole. So when the gates opened and the cameras waited, Joe didn't play the part of the bitter ex-con. He played the philosopher returning from exile. He stepped into the daylight in a tailored suit, silver showing at the temples, eyes bright behind dark glasses. To the journalists who shouted his name, he smiled. "I'm a new man now. I'm in the construction business." But everyone in Brooklyn knew that meant anything but construction. Joe wasted no time making his intentions clear. The old 1963 peace deal didn't apply to him. Almost immediately, a message derived from Joe Colombo, the current boss of the former Profaci family. Colombo extended what he called a gesture of goodwill, $1,000 in cash, meant as a token of peace and welcome. It was both symbolic and practical, an acknowledgement that Colombo didn't want another Brooklyn war. Joe laughed. He sent the money back, demanding instead $100,000 if Colombo wanted real peace. "Tell him," Joe said, "that's the price for quiet. Otherwise, I'll turn this town into a fireworks show." He made it clear he despised what Colombo had become. A boss who appeared on television collecting money in the name of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, selling flags, patches, and pins while pretending to be a crusader against discrimination. "Mr. Colombo, are you a boss of the Mafia?" "No, I am not." "Is there a Mafia?" "No, there is not." To Joe, it was hypocrisy of the worst kind, a gangster pretending to be a saint while still shaking down contractors. Colombo's men were stunned by Joe's arrogance. Every messenger sent to reason with him came back humiliated. Joe insulted them one by one, laughing at their diplomacy. "Tell your boss," he said once, "that I don't salute handkerchief salesmen." Joe was a made man, but neither him or his brother Larry had ever climbed higher than the rank of a soldier. For someone so low in the Mafia hierarchy to threaten the boss of the family, well, that was almost unthinkable. Inside the Colombo crime family, men muttered that Gallo must have taken leave of his senses. But them same men seemed to forget who they were talking about. This was Crazy Joe, the same firebrand who had once put so much heat on Joe Profaci that the old Don fled to Miami to hide. The same man who had publicly boasted that he was behind the most sensational gangland killing of the century, the barbershop execution of Albert Anastasia. People called him Crazy Joe for good reason. Defying a boss wasn't madness to him. It was familiar territory. But outside the underworld, Joe Gallo's comeback was met with fascination. America had fallen in love with its outlaws again. The Godfather novel dominated the bestseller lists. The movies again romanticized gangsters as tragic figures with codes and charm. And here came Crazy Joe, articulate, magnetic, unrepentant, walking straight into that cultural moment. He returned to Greenwich Village, to the San Remo Cafe, and Joe sat among actors, artists, and writers who couldn't resist the spectacle. He talked about freedom, fate, and survival, with the same casual tone he'd once used to discuss gunmen. To the bohemians, he was irresistible, a real outlaw who could hold his own in conversation with poets. Playwright Jean Jane, hearing of his story, called him the most dangerous poet that Brooklyn ever produced. Not long after his release, Joe befriended actor Jerry Orbach, who was preparing for the film The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, a comedy loosely based on Joe's own gang wars that you would have seen clips of throughout this documentary. Orbach played a character named Kid Sally Colombo, modeled after Gallo. The film also featured a young Robert Dyro, and by all accounts, Joe found it hilarious. Orbach admired Joe's charisma and intelligence. Joe, in turn, was flattered by the actor's respect. Soon, Joe and his wife Jeffy was socializing with Orbach and his wife Martyr, attending Broadway openings and Manhattan parties. At one premiere, Joe sent actress Joan Hackett a bouquet of flowers with a note attached that read, "Dear Joan, you're a good broad." Hackett later said, laughing, "Bro is a word I'd never accept from anyone but Joe." For the first time ever, the city's intellectual elite treated a gangster as if he were a novelist, and Joe loved it. But prison had changed more than Joe's mind. It had also begun to change his marriage. Whilst he was incarcerated, Jeffy had left him, tired of the isolation and scrutiny. After his release, they reunited briefly, but the old chemistry was gone, and Joe's attention had wandered. He met Sina, a 29-year-old dental nurse, lively, fearless, and drawn to the peculiar glamour of his legend. With her, he seemed softer, almost domestic in quiet moments, though everyone around them sensed that any peace he found would only be temporary. He and Sina settled in Greenwich Village, on streets where musicians, painters, poets, and drifters moved freely, and where fame and obscurity often lived on opposite sides of the same hallway. Joe lived only a short walk from Bob Dylan, whose rise had transformed the village into a kind of bohemian capital, and Joe longed to step into that world. He wanted to write, to paint, to create something that wasn't defined by violence or vendetta. And in the spring of 1971, he took a serious step towards that reinvention. When Viking Press offered him a book deal to tell the story of his life, he and Sina spent long afternoons in the Book shop, browsing through poetry and philosophy in the latest village literary obsessions, building a life that teetered between romertance, reinvention, and escape. Crazy Joe Gallo, the gangster who had once walked the streets of Brooklyn with a mountain lion and a grin, was now trying to carve out a place in the artistic world. Still dangerous, still unpredictable, but reaching for something more than the mythology that he had created. For a while, Brooklyn stayed eerily still, watching his every move, every weird move that Crazy Joe took. As Joe Colombo and the rest of them saw it, he was quieter now, more deliberate, and therefore, in some ways, more unnerving to Colombo and the rest of the family. But that illusion of calm didn't last long. Word spread through social clubs and cafes that Joe was recruiting again. Not just Italians from the old neighborhood, but black and Puerto Rican hoodlums who saw him as a hero and wanted in on the action. What unsettled the old guard mobsters even more was the rumor behind it. That Gallo had stayed close with Nicky Barnes, the Harlem drug kingpin he'd befriended in prison, and that the two men were quietly discussing a business arrangement of their own. To the Mafia, it looked like something close to treason. The idea of a white mob figure aligning himself with a rising black drug organization, especially one as ambitious and organized as Barnes's, was unheard of. And the whispers grew darker that Gallo planned to flood Brooklyn with heroin, build an army of young recruits who didn't care about old rules, and use the money he made to challenge the Mafia power structure itself. For the old guard Mafia, this was a no-go, regardless of whether he planned to overthrow the Mafia. No family boss had ever mixed races in his crew. Joe didn't care. Money doesn't know color, he told one reporter, and neither do bullets. Within months, he reportedly had 100 or more new men orbiting him. Hustlers, stick-up kids, small-time dealers. A new kind of street army that scared the traditional mob. They didn't understand his loyalties, his humor, or his unpredictability. They only knew that the man they tried to bury was alive again, and building something that didn't follow their rules. Among the upper ranks of the Colombo crime family, some whispered that maybe it would be better if someone, anyone, took Joe Gallo off the board for good. Others quietly hoped for open war, the kind that could finally erase the myth. By the spring of 1971, Joe Gallo had become a paradox, a man both inside and outside the Mafia, a celebrity who dined with actors while threatening bosses. Reporters followed him from restaurants to art galleries, fascinated by his ease with fame. He would charm a journalist one moment and terrify a gangster the next. He was back where he always wanted to be, at the center of attention. But this time, it wasn't the gun that gave him power. It was the story. He once told Jerry Orbach that he felt like an actor who'd been written out of his own movie. And now he was writing himself back in it. And as Crazy Joe Gallo sipped espressos in Greenwich Village, laughing with movie stars, the men he'd insulted were already whispering about how to bring down the curtain on his second act. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and somewhere in the distance, Columbus Circle was already being prepared for the next scene. By the spring of 1971, the uneasy peace between Crazy Joe and the ruling Colombo family had already begun to crack. Joe Colombo had spent the past few years transforming himself from a quiet racketeer into one of the most publicly visible men in America. His vehicle for that transformation was the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization he created in 1970 after his son's arrest. Publicly framed as a fight against discrimination and the FBI's use of the word mafia. We feel that the people have had it, and the Italian people in particular in the United States, which number 38 million, have been losing its identity as time has been going on more and more and more so. What began as a calculated publicity stunt quickly swelled into a mass movement. Colombo was everywhere, smiling for cameras, shaking hands with city officials, and leading marches under the bright tree-recolor banners of the League. You are one. Nobody could take you apart anymore. Cheering. Thousands of working-class Italians filled the streets at his rallies, waving flags, singing the national anthem, shouting that they were tired of being portrayed as gangsters. The irony was lost on most of them. Colombo, the man protesting the stereotype, was himself the head of one of New York's 5 families. To the press, he was a folk hero. To the FBI, a hypocrite. And to Crazy Joe Gallo, he was a joke. Gallo despised everything Colombo represented, the smiling hypocrisy, the moral speeches delivered from a podium built on extortion money, the phony respectability of a man who could order a beating at breakfast and bless a crowd by lunchtime. God bless you and thank you. To him, Colombo was soft, vain, and dangerously loud. By early June, the whispers were moving through Little Italy and Bensonhurst that Joe Gallo was now ready for war. But Colombo seemed too distracted to notice. The success of his league had gone to his head. He'd taken to staging massive public rallies, giving speeches surrounded by American flags, and inviting politicians to stand beside him. He told his followers that the FBI's use of the term Mafia was a slur against Italians, and that the League would fight it in court. Privately, many of his peers on the commission were appalled. The mob's power had always come from secrecy, and Colombo's television appearances and endless interviews violated everything that they'd built. His open courting of the press brought heat to all of the 5 families. And even Carlo Gambino, the quiet puppet master of New York's underworld, had started to grumble that Colombo's antics were bad for business. And then came Italian Unity Day, June the 28th, 1971, a day which was to be Colombo's grandest spectacle yet. Columbus Circle in mid-Manhattan was transformed into a festival ground, with crowds spilling out toward Central Park South and down Broadway as the city gathered to celebrate. There were marching bands, children's carrying signs, vendors selling League souvenirs, and thousands of supporters waving both American and Italian flags. The sun was high, the crowd loud and jubilant. Colombo was scheduled to speak just after noon. Security was nominal, more ceremonial than real. The League had issued hundreds of laminated press passes to photographers, volunteers, and self-proclaimed journalists. Among them was a slight, well-dressed black man, known as Jerome Johnson, carrying a camera and wearing one of those official badges. No one questioned him. He mingled easily with the crowd, moving closer to the stage as the speeches began. A few minutes before noon, Colombo stepped up from his limousine and began walking towards the podium. He smiled broadly, waving to the crowd, shaking hands with local officials and parish priests. To his followers, he was the embodiment of Italian success, a man who had tamed the Mafia and turned it into a cause, groaning and screaming. As he reached for the microphone, a single shot rang out. Colombo collapsed instantly, blood erupting from his temple. 2 more shots followed in quick succession. Panic tore through the crowd. Screams, running feet, flags trampled underfoot. Jerome Johnson dropped his camera and tried to flee, but was tackled by Colombo's bodyguards. One of them brandished a revolver and fired 5 times at point-blank range. Johnson died on the way to the hospital, still clutching his fake press. The main speaker was fatally shot. Television cameras caught everything: the chaos, the screaming, the sound of a band still playing a half-finished march while people ducked for cover. For a moment, it was unclear whether Colombo was alive. Then medics swarmed the stage. He was still breathing, barely. An ambulance took him away, sirens slicing through the noise. Newspapers would later call it the day the Mafia went public and got shot for it. Within hours, rumors were spinning in every direction. The obvious suspect, whispered in every precinct, house, and bar room, was Crazy Joe Gallo. He had motive, and most importantly, people believed he now had an army behind him. Black gunmen drawn to him through his friendship with Nicky Barnes. The idea that an Afro-Canadian shooter had taken down Joseph Colombo, a man who'd wrapped himself in Italian pride, was too poetic and too symbolic for anyone to ignore. And everyone remembered that Joe had spent years in prison building friendships with black inmates, talking about alliances, revolution, and tearing down the old way of doing things. Reporters devoured the theory. Now you hear the gangland theory being pushed, that Gallo did make a hit on Colombo. This is merely conjecture and rumor, but there is no newspapers claimed Gallo had outsourced vengeance, that he'd used his new black and Puerto Rican recruits to strike at Colombo in the most humiliating way possible. Overnight, the myth hardened. Crazy Joe had sent a black hitman to publicly execute a Mafia boss in front of his own cheering supporters. Colombo never recovered. The bullet had severed part of his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed and unable to speak. He lingered for another 7 years in a vegetative state, before dying in 1978, aged 54. The League collapsed almost immediately after the shooting. Its bank accounts were frozen, its officers raided, and its followers scattered. The same crowds that had once chanted Colombo's name now whispered it in embarrassment. His movement, once hailed as the dawn of Italian empowerment, was exposed as what the FBI had claimed all along, a front for his extortion and political manipulation. For the Mafia Commission, the problem had been solved neatly without a formal war. But for New York, the spectacle had burned itself into public memory. The city had watched a mob boss gunned down on live television, his crusade ending in screams beneath the statue of Christopher Columbus. As the smoke cleared, the name that lingered was Gallo, but he denied any involvement. "Why would I shoot a cripple?" he smirked, and told reporters. It was the perfect quote: insolent, cruel, and magnetic. Like the Anastasia hits, whether people believed him or not didn't matter. The legend had already written itself. To the public, Joe Gallo had become the dark star orbiting the chaos. He represented everything Colombo wasn't: unpredictable, street-torn, authentic. One had courted the cameras and been shot for it. The other now stepped into that empty spotlight. The shooting made Gallo's celebrity explode. Newspapers plastered his face across front pages again. Journalists compared him to John Dillinger, to Al Capone, to a folk hero who'd survived his own age. The intellectuals who met him in Greenwich Village spoke of him with fascination, saying he was misunderstood, that he had transcended the criminal code. Actors and musicians whispered that they'd known him, that he'd quoted poetry over dinner. Inside the Mafia, fear replaced gossip. Some believed Gallo had orchestrated the assassination with clinical precision. Others thought he was too reckless for such a clean execution. But even those who doubted his guilt couldn't ignore the symbolism. The man who'd spent a decade defying bosses had once again turned the city upside down. Whether by design or coincidence, for Crazy Joe, the event was validation. He saw himself not as a fugitive from the old order, but as a figure of destiny, chosen to outlive it. The newspapers called him the last gangster of the old world and the first of the new. He liked that phrase, and it was one he repeated often. In the weeks that followed, Colombo's organization fragmented. His son, Anthony Colombo, tried to hold things together, but rival capos circled like vultures. The families quietly rearranged their alliances, and Gallo moved freely through Manhattan, dining in Little Italy, laughing in clubs, smiling for photographers who now treated him like a celebrity. Every article, every whispered conversation added another layer to the myth. The gangster who'd survived the old ways, the intellectual criminal who quoted poetry, the man who might or might not have brought down a mafia boss in broad daylight. He had become what he always wanted to be, a living legend. But legends attract attention, and attention in New York's underworld always carried a price. For Joe Gallo, that price was already waiting on Mulberry Street, written quietly into fate. By the spring of 1972, Crazy Joe had become a figure that existed somewhere between myth and man. He had always believed he was untouchable. His enemies had either died, gone to prison, or lost their nerve. He had survived solitary confinement, street wars, betrayals, and insanity. And now he was living what he thought was the third act of his life: fame, money, and respectability. He spent his nights at Broadway openings, gallery events, and jazz club. Journalists wrote about his clothes, his manners, his intellect. In the eyes of a curious public, he had almost become respectable. On April the 7th, 1972, Joe turned 43 years old. He was 3 weeks into his new marriage with Sina, the young dental nurse who'd given him what looked from the outside like peace. The wedding was intimate and improvised, held inside Jerry and Martyr Orbach's apartment in Chelsea, with the comedian David Steinberg, one of Joe's closest village companions, standing proudly as his best man. And now, with his new wife by his side, he wasn't spending his birthday hiding or in a cell. He planned to celebrate properly. Not in Brooklyn, where ghosts still lingered on President Street, but in Manhattan, where celebrities gathered and cameras flashed. The night began at the Copacabana nightclub, the legendary East 60th Street supper club that for decades had been the beating heart of New York's nightlife, a place where mobsters, celebrities, politicians, and Broadway stars sat side by side. And tonight, Don Rickles was performing his usual sharped act. Joe was the supposed owner of the Copacabana at this time, which wouldn't surprise me, but I couldn't find anything concrete, which is all too typical with mob ties. Joe sat near the front with Sina, her 10-year-old daughter Lisa, his sister Carmela, and his lifelong friend and bodyguard Pete the Greek. The atmosphere was relaxed and full of laughter. Rickles, known for mocking everyone in the room, even teased Gallo lightly. "I see Joey Gallo here tonight. Don't shoot Joey. I'm only kidding." The audience roared, and Joe grinned, enjoying the attention. He'd become so much a part of New York's mythology that even the city's biggest comedians could joke about him without fear. After the show, Joe went backstage to meet Rickles, shaking his hand warmly and inviting him to join the group for a late-night meal. Rickles declined, saying he had an early flight in the morning. Joe smiled and said, "Next time, then, I'll hold you to it." Now, when you played the Copa, who was in the house? What kind of a crowd would come in there when you played the Copa back? You ever hear Joey Gallo? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Hold it down. Huh? My mother rest? She was great. Joey Gallo one night said, "Come on, sit with us." And we sat down at the table, and there were guns around. You know those days, gun. And I said to my mother, I said, "Mom, these guys got guns." She said, "They're wonderful people. These are the people that are going to make you a star." Which a star? Star. The group left just after midnight and climbed into a Cadillac parked out front. The city lights reflected on the windshields as they drove downtown. The radio low, Sinatra playing on the airwaves. They were looking for a place to eat, something simple, open late, away from the noise of Midtown. Driving through Little Italy, they turned onto Mulberry Street, a narrow archery of neon and cobblestone that still smelled of garlic and cigarette smoke. They stopped near the corner of Hester Street, where a new seafood restaurant had just opened, Umberto's Clam House. The neon sign glowed blue and red, and inside the last few tables were still occupied by locals, finishing plates of linguine and white wine. Joe leaned out the window and called to a man standing in the parking lot, asking if the food was good. The man, tall and heavy-set, smiled and said, "Yeah, it's the best in the neighborhood." That man was Matty the Horse Yaniello, a Colombo associate who owned the restaurant, and someone who wouldn't have been too happy with the fact that Crazy Joe shot Joe Colombo 10 months earlier, though whether Joe recognized him or not is unclear. The Gallo party went inside and took a table near the wall. They ordered clumsily calamari and bottles of Chianti. Joe was in high spirits. He was joking with the waiters, teasing Sina's daughter, soaking in the small pleasures of an ordinary meal. He had no reason to think that the night would end any differently than how it had begun. But across the room, another diner recognized him, Joseph Luparelli, a small-time Colombo associate. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man the family had recently marked for death, sitting casually in a restaurant just a few blocks from their own territory. Luparelli slipped out the door quietly and headed towards a nearby club, where several Colombo gunmen were drinking. Among them were Philip Gambino and Sonny Pinto, the man who had killed Ali Baba in Hoboken 9 years earlier. Luparelli told them who he'd just seen and where. Within minutes, they were on their way to Umberto's, weapons hidden under their coats. Inside, the Gallo table was loud with laughter. Joe, facing the wall, raised the glass to his wife, his sister, and Pete, the Greek. "To better years," he said. The hit team entered through the side door a few minutes after 4:30 in the morning. They moved fast, almost silently. In the dim light of the restaurant, only the sound of plates and silverware broke the stillness. Then the first shot cracked through the room. Joe jerked forward, hitting the back. More shots followed. A staccato of thunder echoed off the tile walls. Diners screamed, diving under tables. Joe spun around, pulling his .38 from his jacket. Blood was already soaking through his shirt. He grabbed the heavy wooden table and flipped it on its side, shouting for his family to get down. Sina pushed her daughter under the table. Carmela screamed as glass shattered around them. Pete the Greek returned fire. but the gunmen were already retreating. Joe staggered to his feet, pressing a hand to his wound. His revolver slipped from his grip as he stumbled towards the door, leaving a trail of blood across the floor. He made it outside onto Mulberry Street, the early morning air cold against his face. He tried to reach the Cadillac, but collapsed beside a fire hydrant, breathing shallowly. Within moments, the street was chaos. Flashing lights, sirens, shouting. Carmela ran outside, fell to her knees beside him, and cradled his head in her lap. He was still alive, eyes open, lips moving, but no words came out. She held him there until the police arrived. Go away. Joe Gallo died on the pavement outside Alberto Ula's clam house, a few feet from the restaurant door in the heart of Little Italy, on his 43rd birthday. Despite countless theories, the murder was never officially solved. We don't know for sure who fired the shots back. There was somebody in the restaurant who was sitting at the counter who started to shoot back. We found a gun on the street right next to Joe, but we don't think that was his gun. Years later, men like Frank Sheeran, a Philadelphia hitman and self-proclaimed associate of Jimmy Hoffa, would claim responsibility, saying he'd been sent to do the job. But most historians and most detectives who worked the case agreed that the killers were Colombo loyalists, Philip Gambino and Tsunani Pinto, acting under orders from the wounded family hierarchy to avenge Joe Colombo's shooting and to restore their pride. The headlines the next morning told the story the city already knew by heart. Crazy Joe Gallo has been gunned down in Little Italy. At about 5:30 this morning, the best that we can determine at the moment, an unidentified male walked in the side door, fired some shots, and then ran from the premises. A man walked in from the back door, and he walked up the side of the table. He fired 3 shots. He hit Joe twice, and he hit his bodyguard Pete, the Greek, one time. Joe Gallo is dead at Beekman Downtown Hospital in Brooklyn. Joe's brother Albert received the news just before dawn. He sat in silence for a long time before saying it was bound to happen. But silence quickly turned to rage. Joe had been more than a brother to Kid Blast. He was the myth that carried all of them. With him gone, the Gallo crew lost its center. Albert, now the last brother standing, began plotting revenge. In August 1972, the last remnants of the Gallo crew tried to strike back. Word reached Kid Blast in President Street that several key Colombo figures, Alon's Persico, known as Alley Boy and the son of Carmine, his son Little Ali, and Jaro Jerry Lang Langala, were meeting at the Neapolitan Noodle, a semi-restaurant on East 79th Street, where passers-by couldn't see who was inside. The moment the Gallos learned the 3 men were seated together, Kid Blast and Punchy Iliano got to work. The plan was simple: walk in, take a drink at the bar, and kill every man at the Persico table. But the Persico's look held. Just moments before the gunmen arrived, the Colombo group left their seats at the bar to move to the dining room. 4 businessmen celebrating a family engagement slipped into the vacated stools, unaware that they had just taken the places of marked men. The shooter walked in wearing a shoulder-length black wig, slapped a $10 bill on the counter, ordered a scotch and water, and waited. After a few minutes, he stood up, drew 2 pistols, and opened fire, hitting the wrong table. Sheldon Epstein and Max DeKelch were killed, and 2 others were wounded. The intended target, seated only a few feet away, escaped unharmed. It was one of the rare times in mob history that innocent bystanders were murdered in a hit gone wrong, and the botched attack became a national headline. A humiliating blow to the already fractured Gallo faction. In the months that followed, a fragile peace settled in. The commission intervened, wary of the constant bloodshed. Both sides were ordered to stand down, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Some of the younger Gallo men were restless, frustrated by the lack of money and opportunity under Albert's leadership. In 1974, several of them defected back to the Colombo family. The betrayal reignited the violence. That September, a sniper shot seriously wounded Punchy Iliano, now Albert's top man, near the Gallo headquarters on President Street. The commission once again stepped in, this time with a permanent solution. the Gallo would be absorbed into another family. Albert, tired and weary, accepted. The proposal came from the Genovese crime family, who offered Albert and his remaining men a place under Vincent Chin Gigante's wing. It was an act of mercy or containment. Either way, it ended 2 decades of chaos. Kid Blast was finally made a soldier in the Genovese family, and he was no longer just a rogue. Kid Blast rose to become one of the Chin's most trusted captains. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase headlines, and he learned early that keeping quiet was the best protection a man in his position could have. Over the years, he settled into a steady role inside the Genovese family. Respected for his experience and his reliability, and unlike so many of his contemporaries, Kid Blast never disappeared into witness protection. He never fled the country, and he never died in a back room. Today, at 95 years of age, Kid Blast is still alive, still connected in an advisory sort of way, and by all accounts, still living in Red Hook. His name has slipped into the background just the way that the Mafia likes it. His brother Joe, on the other hand, never faded. Crazy Joe Gallo's name stayed loud. It stayed in newspapers, police files, books, songs, and stories told in bars long after his death. His legend only grew with time. Newspapers turned him into a symbol of rebellion, a gangster who talked like a poet, a killer who quoted philosophy. Writers compared him to Jesse James, to John Dillinger, to a figure straight out of Greek tragedy. He had fought the system, defied the commission, mocked the bosses, and paid for it in the only way men like him ever did, violently and publicly. In 1976, his Greenwich Village neighbor Bob Dylan released the song Joey, a ballad that turned the gangster's story into American folklore. The lyrics painted him not as a criminal, but as a tragic anti-hero, a man of principle, caught in a violent world. Child blew you away. It was romantic, wrong, and perfect all at once. The myth of Crazy Joe Gallo became part of the city's DNA. The man who once tamed a lion on the streets of Brooklyn, who smoked hash with bohemians, who read Canton Voltaire in prison and quoted nature in jazz clubs, who dared to believe he was bigger than the Mafia itself. From the underworld, he was a warning, a reminder that charisma and fame could be as deadly as bullet. For the public, he was the last outlaw of the 20th century, the bridge between the gangsters of the old world and the icons of the new. His story ended fittingly on the streets of New York City, beneath neon lights, surrounded by friends and by enemies halfway between reality and legend. Crazy Joe Gallo died believing he'd become something more than a gangster, and history made sure that he was right. I'd like to finish the story of Crazy Joe Gallo, if I could, with a quote of his. "Wherever you are, be the best at it," and that was something that Joey definitely lived by. He was the best rebel the Mafia had ever seen. Thanks so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it. Please, Snorts, consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video, and liking the video if you were a fan. So once again, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next.